Henri Christophe was born enslaved, with no name of his own choosing and no legal claim to his own body. He died a king inside a palace he built at the foot of a mountain fortress that cost roughly 20,000 lives, most of them belonging to people who had been enslaved just like he once was. In between those two facts, he helped lead the only fully successful slave revolution in recorded history, split a fledgling country in two, crowned himself monarch, and built an entire aristocracy of dukes, counts, and barons out of former slaves who'd fought beside him. Then he put his own people back into a system of forced labor to pay for all of it, which is exactly as complicated and exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. Christophe was born around 1767, most likely on the island of Grenada, to parents who had been enslaved Africans, probably of Senegambian descent, brought across the Atlantic in chains to work Caribbean sugar plantations under British colonial rule, one of millions caught in the same transatlantic trade. As a young man, he gained his freedom before the Great Slave Uprising of 1791, working a string of jobs historians still argue over the exact order of: mason, sailor, stable hand, waiter, and, by some accounts, eventually managing a hotel restaurant called La Couronne in Cap Français, the wealthy colonial capital of French Saint-Domingue, a colony built almost entirely on enslaved sugar and coffee. Labor. When the 1791 uprising exploded into full revolution, Christophe joined the rebellion and rose fast, reaching the rank of colonel while the war against French, Spanish, and British forces, all of them at various points fighting for control of the same valuable colony, dragged on for over a decade. He fought alongside Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines against an enemy that kept changing flags and uniforms but never stopped wanting the same basic thing: the colony's forced labor and the enormous profits that labor produced for someone else, an ocean away. In 1802, Napoleon sent a massive military expedition to Saint-Domingue, tens of thousands of soldiers strong under his brother-in-law General Leclerc, with an explicit goal: crush the rebellion, reassert French control, and restore slavery across the colony exactly as it had existed before the uprising began. The war that followed was brutal on both sides, marked by disease, scorched earth tactics, and mass executions on both sides of the conflict. But it ended in a rebel victory that stunned the imperial world and humiliated one of the most powerful armies on earth. On November 18th, 1803, Christophe helped lead the decisive Battle of Vertières against General Rochambeau's remaining French forces near Cap Français, the last major engagement of the war, breaking French colonial power in Saint-Domingue for good and forcing a full surrender. On January 1st, 1804, Haiti declared independence, the first nation in history founded by a successful slave revolt, and only the second republic anywhere in the Americas after the United States itself. Christophe had gone from being another man's legal property, with no rights a court would ever recognize, to one of the founding generals of an independent nation in roughly a decade, a transformation almost nowhere else in the Atlantic world could offer anyone at the time. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who had become Haiti's first ruler after independence and had himself declared emperor of the new nation, was assassinated on October 17, 1806, in a coup led by rival officers unhappy with his increasingly heavy-handed autocratic rule. In the political vacuum that followed, the fragile new nation, not yet 3 years old and still finding its footing, didn't stay unified for long. A new constitution drafted in the capital reduced the presidency to a largely ceremonial role answerable to a senate, and Christophe, who had commanded armies for years and expected real, personal authority in return, flatly refused to accept it. He retreated north with the troops still loyal to him, set up his own separate government at Cap Henri, and on February 17, 1807, became president of what he called the State of Haiti, governing roughly the northern half of the country. In the south, Alexandre Pétion was elected president of a rival republic, and for over a decade the two men ruled as bitter enemies on the same small island, each controlling roughly half of a country barely 3 years removed from revolution and still learning what independence was even supposed to look like. One side was led by a mixed-race Republican who kept at least the outward trappings of an elected government, a Senate, and regular succession. The other was about to become something else entirely. On March 28, 1811, at a council of state he himself had convened, Christophe declared his northern state a kingdom and had himself proclaimed King Henri I of Haiti. He didn't stop at the crown. He built an entire European-style royal court from nothing: 4 princes, 8 dukes, 22 counts, 37 barons, and 14 knights, granted hereditary titles complete with newly designed coats of arms, and passed down through their families in perpetuity. Nearly every one of these new nobles, like the king who ennobled them, had been born enslaved, and most had earned their titles fighting in the same revolutionary army Christophe had risen through himself, not through inherited bloodlines the way European nobility usually worked. European observers mocked the whole arrangement anyway, as a costume pageant playing dress-up with royalty. To Christophe, the point was never costume. It was proof, aimed as much at Europe as at his own subjects, that black Haitians could build the exact kind of state that had once enslaved them, on their own terms, with their own crowns, their own bloodlines, and their own claim to permanence in the world. This wasn't just personal vanity, whatever else it was. Crowning himself king in the exact grammar European monarchies used was a direct, deliberate message to the empires still refusing to recognize Haiti at all. We can perform sovereignty as convincingly as you can, and better armed. That message came with a very real, well-founded fear behind it, not paranoia invented after the fact. France had already tried once, in 1802, to reconquer the colony and restore slavery, and absolutely nothing on paper or in practice guaranteed it wouldn't simply try again the moment it had the resources and the political will. Christophe's answer to that fear was enormous, literal, and built entirely out of stone. A fortress positioned so high and so remote that any future invasion would become prohibitively expensive in both time, money, and lives. The Citadelle La Ferrière, also called Citadelle Henri, was constructed atop the 900-meter peak of Bonnet-à-Levique, several kilometers inland from the coast, with walls thick enough to withstand cannon fire and commanding views in every direction across the surrounding valleys and out toward the sea. Tens of thousands of laborers, most of them former slaves who had fought or lived through the very revolution that freed them, were conscripted to haul stone, iron, and hundreds of heavy cannons up the steep mountain trails entirely by hand, with no machinery to ease the burden. Estimates of the death toll during construction run as high as 20,000 lives, lost to accidents, exhaustion, and disease during the years of hauling and building, while building a fortress whose entire declared purpose was making sure no one could ever enslave the survivors again. At the foot of the same mountain, in the town of Milhaud, Christophe built the Sans-Souci Palace, an opulent royal residence with fountains, terraced gardens, and a grand marble staircase, which admirers nicknamed the Versailles of the Caribbean almost from the moment it was finished. Here's the part that's genuinely hard to sit with, no matter how sympathetic you are to his reasons. To pay for the fortress, the palace, and the entire royal court, Christophe imposed a system of compulsory agricultural labor across his own kingdom, enforced with strict military-style discipline and harsh penalties for anyone who resisted. In 1812, he formalized it into law as the Code Henri, a lengthy body of statutes covering administration, education, moral order, and above all, strict obedience to mandatory plantation labor on both state-owned and private estates across the kingdom. Ordinary Haitians recognized the resemblance immediately because it was hard to miss. A labor system that looked, felt, and functioned uncomfortably close to the plantation slavery an entire generation had just fought a full-scale, decade-long, blood-soaked revolution to escape. The man who had once been enslaved himself was now running a kingdom that kept its own formerly enslaved citizens legally tied to the land, working fields they didn't own under overseers who answered directly to the crown, for the declared purpose of building monuments to a freedom they weren't fully allowed to exercise themselves, in the name of a country they had personally helped to free. It's one of history's sharpest, most self-contradicting ironies. The fortress meant to guarantee no one would ever be enslaved again was built, in significant part, by labor practices its own laborers experienced firsthand as a new version of the very thing the fortress was supposed to prevent forever on the very land they had already bled to free. Resentment over the corvée system simmered for years beneath the surface of an otherwise functioning, even genuinely prosperous kingdom, and Christophe's declining health eventually gave that long-simmering resentment its opening. In August 1820, at the age of 52, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed, physically weakening a man whose entire authority had always rested on being visibly, undeniably in command. Word of his condition spread quickly through the kingdom, and a military rebellion began building against him almost immediately among officers, nobles, and exhausted laborers alike. Facing capture, a likely coup, and a body that could no longer command soldiers the way it once had, Christophe chose not to wait around and find out exactly how the rebellion would end for a paralyzed king with no army left he could fully trust. On October 8, 1820, alone inside the Sans-Souci palace he built at the foot of his own mountain fortress, King Henri I shot himself in the heart with a silver bullet, reportedly to avoid the indignity of being captured alive. 10 days later, his son and heir, Jacques Victor, was assassinated by rivals who saw no reason to let the royal line continue into a second generation. The kingdom collapsed within weeks, and Haiti was reunified under a new government led by Jean-Pierre Boyer, meaning the mountain fortress built to survive a French invasion that never came ended up outliving the kingdom it was built to protect by only a matter of days.